Unit 6, Absolutism versus Constitutionalism, the Puritan Revolution, Part 2. Charles I was far more defiant than his father, and during the opening years of his reign, his political and religious critics began to join together in a serious rebel party. Charles I was a staunch high churchman, valuing the Catholic elements of Anglicanism, and he held his father's view on divine right monarchy. He hated the hated Duke of Buckingham continued to be chief minister. Charles immediately quarreled more violently with Parliament than his father had ever done. The new king demanded money, but Parliament was only interested in impeaching Buckingham. Charles, in turn, levies a forced tribute loan on members of the nobility and the high gentry. 76 prominent men, including several members of Parliament, were jailed for refusing to pay. When Charles asks for money again, he found both Commons and Lords united against him. Both houses cooperated closely in framing the famous Petition of Right, in which they extracted his promise not to levy taxes or borrow money without parliamentary consent, nor imprison men without due process of law. By agreeing to these conditions, Charles acknowledged that he had violated his subjects' liberties. Even though the Petition of Right at a constitutional landmark, becomes a constitutional landmark, its initial effect was slight. With Charles continuing his abusive methods, nonetheless, by the end of 1628, one grievance was permanently removed. The Duke of Buckingham was assassinated, much to the king's grief and the public's joy. Now religion reared its ugly head into the argument. Charles' support of the policies of Archbishop Laud brought both the ire of Anglicans and Puritans. Laud tried to impose elaborate Catholic-style ritual on all churches that led many people to believe that the country was being led back to Roman Catholicism. Charles didn't help the situation when he married the sister of the Catholic King of France, Louis VIII, whose name was Henrietta Marie. When Parliament convened at the beginning of 1629, both sides were in a frenzy. When Sir John Eliot opened Parliament with 3 resolutions declaring many of the king's actions to be treasonous, Charles was horrified and ordered the Speaker of the House to adjourn the meeting. This guy, Speaker John Finch, tried to rise from his chair to adjourn the meeting and was sat back down forcibly by 3 of the more athletic members of Parliament. This move not only galvanized the radicals in Parliament, but also alienated many of the more moderates and made Charles look more reasonable than his adversaries. Shortly after this event, Charles declared personal rule and ruled without Parliament from 1629 until 1640. Keep in mind, Parliament was only called during this period when a monarch needed assistance in matters usually referring to the power of taxation. Being that monarchs before him constantly needed money, Parliament was frequently in session. Charles attempted a Richelieu-like regime in England. But without any intendants or standing army, Charles was severely hamstringed. The king's top 2 advisors, Sir Thomas Wentworth and Archbishop Laud, searched for legal loopholes by which to evade Parliament control over taxation. Feudal requirements on knighthood brought in heavy fines from the nobility. Charles's most famous abuse of non-parliamentary taxation was that of ship money, in which he levied heavy fees on first coastal areas and then inland regions to pay for the construction of a new navy. And still, the most explosive issue was religion. Charles I entrusted management of the state church to Archbishop Laud, a man that was unyielding to compromise. Where Richelieu gave religious toleration to the Huguenots, Laud deliberately challenged the Puritans. But even the majority of Laud's Anglican clergy didn't support him. In 1637, when 3 anti-Laud Puritan pamphlet writers by the name of Burton, Bastwick, and Prynne were put on trial and had their ears cropped, which was an old medieval practice of having their ears chopped off, they were hailed as martyrs. The biggest trouble for Laud, however, came in Scotland, when Charles I and Laud tried to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Presbyterian populace. The Scots rejected the prayer book, and rebellion was imminent. Charles tried to suppress the Scottish rebellion, but he could not raise an effective army, and by 1640 the Scots had invaded northern England. The king was now completely cornered. With no money, no army, and no popular support, he had to summon Parliament in 1640. The Long Parliament, so called because it remained in session from 1640 to 1653, triggered the biggest revolution in English history. Scholars have argued for centuries over the sides and reasons for the English Revolution. Although most have settled on religious and political principles, Puritans versus Anglicans, Parliament versus absolute monarchy. Still, others contended that this was one of the first true class revolutions and a major victory for the English bourgeoisie. It is hard to deny, however, that religion was the true catalyst.